All right, this demonstration is to show you how to draw an object above your eye level, and we're going to add quite a bit of complexity to this one because we've got an object with changing width, the neck gets really narrow, and then we're also going to be adding a label on this one. So the label is kind of a tricky thing, but it's really cool if you can figure out how to do it right. So I've already spent quite a bit of time measuring out this drawing, and I'm making sure that my ellipses at the base of the bottle are quite a bit flatter since they're near eye level. And then objects, as we move away from the eye level, are going to get rounder and rounder. So the proportions of the ellipses are going to go from, it's still fairly round here. This is about 2.5 times as long as it is tall. And then each one of these gets slightly wider. So I will kind of point out how I figured this out. So for objects that are all within the same width of the object, it's pretty easy to make these adjustments. It gets trickier when we get to a narrower dimension. So you can use a ruler or you can use your skewer, but I think using this just so that you can see really easily how the measurements are changing. So the base ellipse is the one that's going to be the very bottom of the wine jug. And so right now it's right around, we've got 5 there for the measurement. And then what I'm going to do is just kind of shift it up. So I'm going to move it up to the point where I'm looking at the bottom of the paper label that's on there, and I've plotted out another ellipse. It's just shifted up. And notice it's just a tiny bit, so I've had to increase the measurement a little bit. It's a very small amount because really those 2 ellipses in real life are just maybe an inch apart from one another, so there should not be a radical difference in the proportions of the ellipse. It'll just be a very small change to slightly rounder as we get farther from our eye level. So I've just added maybe the equivalent of an eighth of an inch to that next ellipse. Now we're going to jump up 4 or 5 inches on the actual bottle to the ellipse that the top of the paper label is going to have to wrap around. So since that was a little bit more significant jump, I made a little bit bigger change in the measurement. So I've added another, let's say, 1/4 inch to that ellipse. So it's a little bit closer to a circle. And then as we move up to where the shoulders of the bottle happen, that ellipse is not much above where the label is. So it's a pretty small change. But again, I added maybe, let's say, an eighth of an inch to that measurement. Now we're getting to this point where we're changing width on the bottle. So we can't just use a flat vertical measurement anymore and expect those ratios to be believable. So we have to measure again. So I used my skewer and I measured the width of the neck of the bottle against the height of that ellipse where it connects to the bottle. And because we're below the bottle, we can't really even see this very well. You can kind of see through the glass in the photograph. The label's blocking it a little bit. So I'm relying more on what I know about ellipse proportions than what I can actually measure. So I know it has to be a little bit closer to a circle than the ellipse that's below it. These ellipses were about twice as wide as they are tall. And so I need it to be a little bit rounder than that. So I took some measurements and I'm shooting for one that's, actually I'm going to make it even a little bit rounder. I think I'm going to go back to a slightly rounder ellipse. This has gotten a little bit flat in my sketch, so we're going to make it a little bit rounder, so slightly closer to a circle. And then the ellipse at the top of the bottle is also a much narrower cylinder, so it also needs to, I have to go back and check the height versus the width. And at this point, 1.5 of the heights of this ellipse will fit into its width. So I've already kind of plotted out where all those need to be to save, a half an hour of the demo time. You're going to need to invest quite a bit of time when you've got this many things going on in the drawing. But let's go ahead and start darkening things in. So I'm going to start with the visible part of the ellipse. I'm going to use an ebony pencil just so that you can see it in the photograph a little bit better. And again, this may not be perfect, but it'll give you an idea of how to kind of darken things in. So this is the foot of the bottle that we are looking up underneath. I'm going to go ahead and kind of plot out the outer edges of the bottle too. And again, this may need to be refined a little bit as we go. Now this part I am going to darken in a little bit since we are looking up at the bottle there, and this part darken in as well. All right, now the label is where it gets a little bit tricky. And what we need to remember is that label, even though it doesn't wrap all the way around the bottle, it's still following the same curve that the bottle follows. So one common mistake that people will do when they try to add a label is if it's a small label, they are following some different ellipse for some reason, and it doesn't really feel like it's laying on the outer surface of the bottle. So make sure that when you plot out those ellipses, I'm going to kind of darken it in just so you can see it a little bit better. This is the ellipse that marks the bottom edge of the label. And again, even though the label doesn't go all the way around the bottle, that guideline does need to go all the way around. And again, you probably should add your axis line so that you can make sure you're keeping it symmetrical. And then the ellipse at the top of the bottle label also needs to go the full width of the bottle. And I've drawn that a little bit pointy there, but see if we can round that out. And again, kind of keep track of where those ellipse lines would be. So now we're looking at the actual bottle in real life, and we're noticing how far that label wraps around. It looks like it's, almost, when considering like where the center line is, and I feel like maybe it's halfway or so between the center line of the object and the outer edge of the object. So let's try it here to start with. We can always adjust a little bit if we're off. So now we're going to darken in the visible parts of that label. We're going to keep the dotted lines on the hidden part of the bottle, because if we can look through the glass on that photograph, it seems like the label might actually wrap around on the back side a little bit, and we could draw that in as a dotted line just to kind of let the viewer imagine this whole object as a transparent bottle. So here's where line weight really comes into play. If you draw all these lines equally dark, the drawing gets really confusing, but if you darken in the visible parts and you leave the hidden parts as dotted lines, then the viewer can start to understand the drawing a little bit better. All right, so we've got a label on there. And then I do want to kind of draw this in, even though it's hidden, we can kind of see it through the glass, so we'll draw that in. And put your axis lines in. I noticed that the top part of my ellipse was a little bit flatter than the bottom, so I am correcting that as I go. All right, and then this top part is quite complex because it's not just a straight area. So what we need to do is we're going to draw in the ellipse that we can see on the bottom side of that and kind of think about where the far side is. And then there's a thickness change. So I'm going to add another ellipse that kind of projects that plane out a little bit wider. And again, if we could see through it, there'd be another ellipse that goes around the back. And then there might be a little bit of a bulge here where the mouth of the jar is a little bit wider. And again, you should draw the back side of those ellipses too, so you're always thinking about it as a transparent object. And then there might even be, if we really could see through the glass, there would be the ellipse of the mouth itself, the actual opening. So again, kind of draw things in if things don't look quite right. Erase the mistaken lines, and do try to include the axis lines for each one of those ellipses. We've actually got 3 or 4 different ellipses that all are used here in that top area to describe that bottle. So I'll try to square this up a little bit. And you might find that you have a lot more control on one side of the bottle than the other, that your lines are more accurate. So if that's true, you can always turn your drawing upside down and draw on your stronger side. So it might be that I have a little bit better control doing it that way. So there's a bottle drawn as if it's above the viewer's eye level or the artist's eye level. So this would be our example number 2 on the homework assignment. And then if you used a really greasy pencil like I did, take a minute to clean up all those smudges. Again, leave the construction lines for me so that I know that you really were thinking about your axis lines. Don't erase those lines, leave them in there lightly. But every ellipse should have an axis line drawn through it, and then the object itself should have a center line, which ends up becoming the short axis of every one of these ellipses and keeps the object from getting lopsided.